dear ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear colleagues and guests, welcome to the scientific evening of the University of Nova Gorica in this beautiful Lantieri mansion. It is my great honor and privilege to introduce our tonight's guest, Professor Dirk Hoerder. He is one of the most important historians of migration in the world, and among so many books he published, I would like to mention his referential work, Cultures in Contact. With this book, we didn't get only the history of migration. We got the global history of humankind. And what is even more important, we got it from the perspective that goes beyond Eurocentrism and from the perspective which focuses not on charts, on maps, on numbers, on workforce, but on migrants themselves, on women, men, children, and this is also the topic of tonight's lecture. Please welcome Professor Dirk Hoerder.
Thank you very much for this introduction. I'm, of course, very happy to be here in a room that I have not usually taught in. Universities do not quite have this quality of teaching rooms, so I'm very happy to be here. Let me begin my talk with a personal yet scholarly reflection. The broad range of human experience that my lecture will cover is possible only because throughout my career I could learn from colleagues on common people's lives in migration, in working in former immigration countries, and as part of their skills had experienced socialization in the migrants' culture of origin. Among the many colleagues with whom I enjoyed cooperating since the late 1970s were scholars from the universities of Ljubljana, Maribor, and now Nova Gorica. They too introduced me to peasant and urban cultures from which some of the migrant men and women came. Those I will discuss. Scholarship is a cooperative venture. Either we learn from each other, or we end up in one-way streets, or far worse, in the clash of civilizations view of history. When I began to be interested in migration, few people cared. The media in Germany never mentioned migration, except, of course, for the Turks. At the time, we called our approach history from the bottom up. The history of the 90 to 95% of men and women and children who are not mentioned in the top-down, imperial, or national histories. However, after reading the life stories of migrants, letters, diaries, autobiographies, sometimes rambling reminiscences, I asked myself, why from the bottom up? The people who remembered their lives and often reflected on the course they had taken were central to their own stories. They were the core. Politics, in contrast, were distant and marginal. Still, they were aware that developments on a larger scale, depressions, wars, government policies, and class hierarchies, and for peasant families, a few bad winters or rainy summers influenced decisions and could change life courses. Here in the Gorica and Vipava region, let's say in the 1840s, families on their farms did check the weather each morning. Early warm sun meant a good day for haymaking, a clobbering hailstorm, less food in winter. There was a perspective in there. Repeated inclement weather might mandate borrowing of money at interest and to repay money to be earned where wage work was available. Trieste, for example. Local history is in a way regional and global. In Guangdong province in South China, peasants were facing the very same issues, but the frames were different for them. The equivalent of Trieste became Hong Kong, founded only at the end of the 1840s. It provided jobs and shipping connections. The founders were foreigners, the British, with far-reaching relations to job markets, as well as a drug-based balance of trade in Asian societies. They forced opium on local people. China's imperial government also was not doing its job very well. Among common people, debts accrued, migration, often involuntarily, or in China under indenture, followed. In both regions, Goritsa and Guangdong, people had to make their decisions about their lives daily. Ideologues of nations arguing that nations rest on soil-rooted peasants were wrong. The men and women did not cling to farmlands, even though they accepted their lifestyle and were proud of their achievements. But they had to ask, where could they use their capabilities to the best is to feed themselves, their families at the place of birth, or as young men and women, their newly formed families. Migration trajectories linked the social spaces where they made their decisions and those where they knew jobs to be available. They knew because trusted friends and neighbors sent information by letter, through someone traveling, or a visit home. Historians have neglected such sources. But to focus this time on another migration direction again, millions of letters crossed the Atlantic each year and relayed information to prospective migrants. Come, there's a job available. Don't come, the economic slump brought unemployment. So that we have exactly this combination of big frame and individual decisions in life courses. This type of information induced roughly 55 million men and women to cross the Atlantic. This also has escaped historians ensconced at their desks and writing tales of national grandeur, the so-called master narratives. For the emigrants, their local space of origin had provided no options. The nation-state had provided no options. Under social structures, top-down, and demographic growth, bottom-up, to use the old bottom-top designations, income-providing jobs did not match mouths to feed. The self-positioning nations were never mentioned in the official histories, economic disaster regions for many people living in them. I repeat, 55 million of them left Europe, 1830s to early 1950s. Not only the local is global, so is the macro-regional. In the societies of the Indian Ocean, 1830s to 1930s, another about 50 million left the local space of socialization. In this term, space of socialization is a description far more exact than mere place of birth or the big so-called national identity. And only a slightly smaller number left the provinces of northern China, Shandong in particular, from Manchuria. And from European Russia, some 10 to 15 million moved to southern Siberia and the Russian Far East. And those of these Russians who reached the Amur River could, on the other side of the river, see their co-migrants from Shandong arrive from the south. Earlier, and with far more violence involved, some 12 million Africans had been deracinated by violence, sold as commodities, and deposited in barracks, the warehouses for human beings, in the global plantation belt in the Americas. This global perspective has only counted the international migrants, not those internal to states, which were far larger in number. In the 1880s, the population of most European cities consisted of just over 50% immigrants. Some noticed this and considered the newcomers country bumpkins, could be paid lower wages, or this was a parallel Marxist version in early 1900s Russia, considered them peasants not born into the urban industrial proletariat and thus not of proper class consciousness. These scholars, or let's replace the word scholars by commentators, could have asked different questions. How did a young man or a young woman, and most migrated between the ages of 15 or 17 and the ages of 25 to 27, how did these young people find their way, find accommodation, a job, insert skills learned in the village or an urban neighborhood, in a different city, in the economy of arrival? How did they insert themselves into a labor market slot? Migration requires strategic social skills that people remaining in one and the same local regional culture throughout their lives never need. Migration experiences expand human capabilities, human capital. Failure of the migrant men and women could not afford. They had no savings to fall back on, no credit rating to borrow money. Depart, travel, find a job. To achieve this, they established information networks long before technicians began to lay transatlantic cables or technical connections between Trieste and, let's say, Pravachina, or between a village near Hong Kong and a job niche in Singapore or Malaya. They arrived just in time for a job long before economists and business people invented this practice to cut costs. Turn after this big picture to the borders that people had to traverse. Moving men and women crossed borders. For example, the Slovenian-speaking one from this region on their way to Trieste. It was a language border. The Habsburg Empire at that time was still intact. Others crossed borders between states. Before the 1880s, and in fact before 1914, the modern border and passport regime had not yet been introduced. Capitalists wanted workers, bourgeois families domestic help, young men and women jobs. Politicians did not interfere very much at that time. However, in terms of gender, the issue of borders and boundaries appears in a different perspective. Men, once the default setting of history writing, moved from peasant smallholds where they worked the earth to infrastructural development where they worked the earth, if differently so. They usually got their jobs through male information networks and thus ended up in a labor crew of fellow villagers with a foreman who had learned enough of the receiving society's language to mediate between migrants and entrepreneurs. With the road construction in Trieste, digging the Suez or Panama Canal, or leveling ground for the Uganda Railroad. Regional as well as global uneven development, investment strategies, and economic growth impact on the life chances and thus the decision-making of locals across the world. These migrant men did neither change skills nor language, and they often hired someone to cook their customary food, as did Slovenian men helping dig the Suez Canal. If men moved into the new and fast-growing industries, this was different. Tailorization deprived skilled artisans and workers of the usability of their know-how, their human capital. Backward peasants, quote-unquote, from somewhere else could be employed as unskilled workers at lower wages than the prior skilled ones in the factories. Well, the backward peasants from early childhood on had acquired a wide range of capabilities. They could tend animals, mow with the skies. Has any one of you ever tried that? It's difficult. Repair farm wagons, shingle roofs. In the factory, in our older thinking, industry was a way to modernity, and historical master narratives still argue this. In the factory, they had to endlessly repeat one and the same movement within a Chicago slaughterhouse, a Pittsburgh steel factory, or a Detroit automobile factory. One of the small farmers who left his village in South China knew his transoceanic route, but the racialized labor market sent him into a British Columbia sawmill where he could not use all his experience. In the sawmill, he sawed one board after the other, day in, day out. Modern machinery meant de-skilling of peasant men. Industrial modernization provided money, wages, but at the cost of loss of capabilities. In the new industries, the old human capital could not be invested. What was asked for was only muscle power. For women, the very same physical trajectory from Gorica to Trieste, or from a Guangdong village to Singapore, Batavia, or Manila involved a different experience. Gender boundaries erected within, not between societies, prevented them from entering many labor market segments defined as male. What was primarily open to them was domestic work. After arrival, men entered earthwork and women entered the kitchen, except that for the women, this was an urban middle-class kitchen. They had to cross the border between rural and urban lifestyles, as well as between the material, behavioral, and emotional class cultures. The adjustments demanded of them were enormous. Peasant life on a smallhold, a few days' trip, entry into a middle-class paid service job. Since before 1914, much of the domestic service was of the live-in type. They hardly had any refuge. Men discontent with the boss could go to the local resto for a glass of wine or a pub for a glass of beer and gripe with fellow men. Women had only minimalist servants' quarters, not always a room of their own, and few other domestics to exchange grievances with. Domestic work, the generic term, is as unsatisfactory a term for women's labor as unskilled worker is for men's. Domestic work may be dirty, cleaning, scrubbing, any kind of work the employer family felt too good for. Bon à tout faire, good for everything in French. Domestic work may also involve cooking. The food had to be tasty. Cooking is a skilled job. It may involve sewing clothes, another skilled category. Migration and food habits were closely entwined. The British so-called national taste for curries was acquired by colonizer migrants from their houseboys and women as kitchen help in India. The Vienna cuisine was not Austrian at all, but is a creation of Czech women with Hungarian recipes and Balkan ingredients, a migrant way of cooking. Let's return to the dirty work. If the object to be cleaned happened not to be a floor, but a baby's bottom, the job definition would analytically change to care work. The baby needs to be comforted, coddled, talked to, as do elderly persons for whom domestics care. They are care workers or caregivers, again another skill that involves a hardly conceptualized category of work, emotional labor. Whatever the working woman's own feelings at the moment, the baby, child, adolescent, or elderly person needs a friendly smile. However, physical labor that involves emotional labor at the same time is not getting double recompense. It is classified as reproductive work and then paid less than so-called productive work. Standardized as well as traditional job classifications are gendered, and they have been devised by economists, by men paid by employers. The geographical, social, and emotional trajectory that women moving from Gorica to Trieste and on to Alexandria traversed was complex, required many skills and strategies for life courses. This is admirably traced by the research project here at this university and at the University of Ljubljana. Guangdong women also had to migrate, and some, exactly like the Gorica sisters, with whom they could have compared notes, decided on self-paid migration as ama, a term meaning domestic, caregiver, household manager. Here the connotation was upward to household manager, not downward to dirty work. Given the respect Chinese culture accorded to older persons, they could become honorary grandmothers, fictive but highly respected kin. To keep their independence, they saved money before the trip as not to have to borrow. They wore a distinct black and white dress to show position and authority. They established hostels or pensions in case any one of them would have bad luck with an employer. In a way, they organized for themselves a little society of their own that provided income, self-assurance, social security. The caring, emotional aspect was remembered not only in their own accounts, of which there were a few, but more so in the memoirs of the middle-class families that had hired them. Seemingly, for them, recognition was the rule, rather than the denigration accorded many countrywomen and domestics in other cultures. Obviously, many Alexandrinki achieved the same position and emotional relationship, and their protégés remembered them. Swedish maids did so in Chicago, Finnish ones in smaller communities on both sides of the US-Canadian border. But it was part of the ama work ethos not to marry. Many of the Swedish women did, and men often sought them out as partners because they had become bicultural and could help a man to acculturate. Some men, on the other hand, did not look out for them. They could not deal with a woman as a partner who had capabilities they did not have. Some men have very brittle identities. The borders that the women crossed may have been and often were difficult. They were obstacles. But most of the women, even if their departures had been forced by circumstances, made the decision consciously. Accepting the subservient position, if the employing family was helpful, provided them with a wage income, with an apprenticeship in household management, a stepping stone to social skills they could not have acquired at home, quote unquote, the home that did neither nourish nor teach them. Their otherness, their being different, was a resource to enter a labor market with no competition from local women. They did so at low wages, as labor and women's historians continue to remind us, but at wages better than anything they could have earned in their unhomely home, and this is often overlooked. That's the positive side. The other, of course, is failure. Not personal failure, as has often been argued by moralists, but non-achievement of goals because of circumstances. An exploitative employing family, sexual harassment by members of the family, illness, unemployment. Further migration might be a possibility. Return was difficult, since returnees without success would be derided. Prostitution was an option. Wages happened to be considerably better than in other labor market segments, domestic work in particular. But social ostracism was a price to pay for as was the commodification of one's body. The aspect of commodification has also usually been discussed in ways separated by gender and a color borderline. Enslaved Africans' bodies were commodified during sale, forced migration, and slave labor. Wage labor is commodified, no mention of the workers' persons. Women's bodies are commodified, not only in labor, but also in prostitution. The physical labor, sexual labor dichotomy needs to be rethought, and I will give only a very few brief suggestions here. A class-conscious Austrian migrant worker reaching the US in 1913 and attacked during a strike in the US by company high thugs felt that the workers had been raped, his words. His masculinity, or more general, his dignity as a human being, had not been respected. Italian migrant steel workers in Pennsylvania bitterly commented that they had treated draft animals on their little farms in the Apennine Hills better than the bosses treated them. The draft animals were fed and stabled. The workers had to fend for themselves with minimal wages. Workers could also be discarded. On the other hand, in much of the immigrant West in North America, along track-laying jobs in mining communities, sex workers were often considered with some respect as entrepreneurs. The way they ran amusement centers, could set up a dancing tent with a board floor on short notice, they were capable workers. Let me first turn from these remarks to the issue of human capital, and I will take two individuals as examples, a young Swedish immigrant man in Canada's West around 1900 and a Philippine woman in a Toronto neighborhood around 2000. Edwin Alm came from a small village. The family had moved frequently. He remembered poverty, coldness, and religiosity. For his education, the family had to go into debt. School books they could not afford. As hired boy on a farm, he was keenly aware of rigorous class distinctions. As a driver at a traveler's hostel, he slept in an unheated garret in the stable, by custom placed above the manure pile because decomposing manure produces warmth. He was on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. He observed men and women emigrating and wanted to join. And he was lucky. A visiting immigrant presented him with the necessary sum for travel. Countrymen on the boat directed him to the Swedish colony in Seattle, Networks. He took any job available, turnip pulling on a farm of a Swede, road work for a logging company, farm work again, flexibility. When a Swedish foreman mistreated the workers, he and his Finnish co-workers walked off. Pride in work and personhood. The economic crisis of 1907 forced them to come back and work for nothing but food. Later, contrary to his class experience in Sweden, he, the immigrant, was accepted as equal by townspeople. Quote, "This was a revelation to me," he commented in his autobiography. He found friends in his hometown, worked with Norwegians, Irishmen, Americans, Italians, bought tools from a Jewish storekeeper, danced with a German girl. He was of rebellion, once roughed up a city inspector, and supported free speech fights. He landed a job as a foreman, skills, human capabilities, and within a few weeks set up his own business. The Swedish chore boy had become a Canadian owner of horse and buggy. A contract for a railroad underpass, quote, in his own words again, marked the beginning of a reasonably successful career. He was astute in calculating labor costs and reduced it by hiring machinery and thus gaining a competitive advantage. He hired Russians and Chinese and women to cook for a construction camp. He was capable and both quick to situationally adapt and to strategically plan. While his was a modest success, his closest friend died in a work accident. These negative outcomes we often overlook. If we think in terms of capabilities and perception of capabilities by neighbors, nobody in his Swedish neighborhoods would ever have thought that this boy had capabilities that could be used in this way. I change to my second person. Davina migrated from Toronto to Toronto from Urdaneta, a town of some 130,000 inhabitants north of Manila, Philippines. At age 26, she had already worked in Palermo, Italy for 2 and in London, UK for 3 years. She had acquired international experience in care work. Canada, she entered with a temporary work visa for the live-in caregiver program, which offers landed immigrant status regular permission to stay after 2 years of caregiving work in citizen status after 4 years in the country. This was a rare promise in today's labor-importing, self-described democracies, proud of their respective human rights record. Her otherness, the concept discussed a moment ago, provided her with an opportunity to enter a labor market segment that she strategically chose to pursue. Many other Filipinas also first acquired experience in Europe, Asia, or Arab and Eastern Mediterranean societies. This transnational experience, they lived transculturally, not as Philippine citizen in Italy, but as someone with a childhood socialization in a town half the size of Ljubljana, acculturated at age 21 in an urban neighborhood of Palermo. Divina, like most women from the Philippines, and for that matter from Mexico, Sri Lanka, and the Dominican Republic, among others, considers her family in Urdaneta her home. But in the 36 years she has been away, she has visited only twice. Instead, she has sponsored her sisters to join her in Toronto. She is creating her own community. Acquiring Canadian citizenship made her, quote, free, she said. And from live-in domestic jobs, she advanced to more satisfactory caregiving ones. She did not miss her family, who, given her remittances, considered her the ideal breadwinner. That's also a concept many historians miss, that women are breadwinners. The Philippine government concurs. Without migrant remittances, the state would long have defaulted. She explained, quote, I can't stay in the Philippines because I just keep sending money. If I visit, they have less money. This independent Filipina woman, also daughter, sister, and migrant, in many respects resembled the Alexandrinke, who sent money home and prevented Slovenian families from defaulting on debt payments and losing their land to fascist Italy when this region was part of Italy. Another perspective, the children Divina cared for perhaps learned Philippine bedtime stories, or those in Alexandria, Slovenian fairy tales. A third perspective, like Edwin's, Divina's story reflects success. The brief accounts young woman from poor rural household in Burgenland wrote here in Austria, for those who are not from the region, in Burgenland, wrote around 1900 in contrast, with dismal stories of exploitation and humiliation by Vienna's respectable middle-class families. And one further reflection. European women migrating to North America from the 1840s to 1914 returned far less often than men. They were fully cognizant that women had better rights in America than in the quote-unquote home country, or should home read the discriminatory place of birth. We turn from these experiences in the development and insertion of human capital to the memory of migration. If men and women struggled for continuity in their lives, always balancing costs with benefits, if they achieved modest success, contributed by remittances to their families at home, or, as in the case of many of the Alexandrink and others across the world, were sent off by their families to ensure the economic survival of those remaining behind in the problem-laden home, how are these achievements remembered? Two larger societal patterns come to mind. Self-described immigration societies usually value contributions, sometimes strictly circumscribe the activities and spaces migrants may engage in, but still are aware of their need for their labor. The other pattern is that of immigration societies. Statesmen and state historians, molded to a national identity paradigm, usually have difficulty coming to terms with immigration decisions which imply or explicitly posit a critique of the society of birth, the nation to which migrants allegedly belong, but which does not provide any options for them. Europe's national histories would look different, as would those of southern and northern China, if rather than talking about Europeans settling the world, analyses would emphasize the push factors: economic distress, rigid social barriers, women's inferior position, dynastic polities with few rights for rural and urban proletarian women and men. That too is the history. Still, societies have been dealing in different ways with the memory of emigration. In Sweden, it is a positive part of public history. It's part of what society was. Museums commemorate and researchers analyze it. In Germany, into the 1990s, what has been called a conspiracy of silence reigned. The Germans had to leave the country, allegedly their country, was not to be part of memory. Suggestions of migration researchers that Germans in the present should treat guest worker immigrants in the present like they wanted German immigrants to be treated elsewhere in the past, of course, came to naught. The underlying bias was that Germans as migrants and Turks as works cannot be compared. In this construction, it so happened that the Germans were the superior ones, along, and I may add, coming from their disastrous trade in German history. I will not discuss memory in the then socialist European societies where emigration could not be a topic. In southern China, in the 1950s, meaning the People's Republic at that time, immigrants were dismissed as irrelevant, the wives and families remaining behind as oppressed by bourgeois marital relations. Cadres suggested, strongly so, that the woman remaining behind divorce. Then a statewide economic analysis came to realize that remittances were crucial for the People's Republic balance of payment. Attitudes in memory were quickly changed. If this sounds like a party engineering memory, we need to be careful in our judgment. US national, not partisan, discourse in the 19th century fell prey to the self-serving adage that the US was the land of unlimited opportunities, with no one in his right mind would leave for the rotten monarchies of Europe. The transatlantic shipping companies knew better. They advertised return voyages. The data which quantitative historians have assembled indicated a return rate of, on average, 1/3 of all immigrants who were, in fact, guest workers, to use this problem-laden term. 1/3 on average, 2/3 for migrants from the South Slav lands, less than 15% for the Jews from pogrom-ridden Russia. Having fallen for its own rhetoric, the US government carefully counted immigrants, meaning many of them temporary migrants, and never counted those departing. If the ideology says that nobody departs, then there's no need to pay statisticians. Only in 1907-08 did this change, and the government did begin to collect statistics on return. Let me now return from the governmental level to local memories, individual, regional, but also society-wide. Like the woman from Goritza, young German-speaking woman from South Tyrol, after 1918, when it had become part of Italy, left southbound for domestic and caregiving jobs in Italian urban families. They had no prospects at home, but were decried as traitors to the annexed Germans' cause. They could never talk about their experiences. After 1945, young women from Styria, Austria, left for domestic and caregiving jobs in Switzerland, where they were called house daughters. Daughters are seemingly incorporated into the family relations, but then daughters are not really receiving wages, are they? They too, upon return, could never talk about their experiences. They had left a homeland where neighbors huddled together to portray themselves as victims of Nazi Germany, leaving the constructed guilt-free memory was treason in the minds of neighbors as well as local and national media. Migration poses questions, and many self-contained societies do not want to answer. Migrants achieve self-agency. Those staying behind need the warmth of an unmoving and unmovable group. Individual migrants are an implicit question to their neighbors who do not want to answer. This, and you'll probably assume this, brings me back from this large global perspective with many examples, here to the regional Gorica, Slovenia one. How were the Alexandrinke remembered? The ongoing project found few stories written by outsiders, found a few old stories written by outsiders, exoticizing and eroticizing ones in the early 20th century. And in 1932, the allegedly traumatic encounter of Europeans with difference, the other, the Orient. Or, one more version, a sometimes church-driven lament about loss of our women. Note the possessive aspect. Then decades of silence. In 2002, a male writer, Marian Tomčić, rediscovered the Alexandrinke. He trumpeted his alleged research and dabbled in cliches, sacrificing mothers, victims of circumstances. In his mental world, the morally corrupt man in Egypt attracted to the woman often happened to be of Muslim faith. The novel and the earlier stories do not mention work and capabilities, fantasies of an author who earned a considerable amount of royalties by slandering women, and obviously finding a paying audience. And if women did turn to prostitution, could they be viewed as entrepreneurs, as in the cases reported from the American West? There are always many perspectives. A historically accurate and differentiated memory still needs to become part of the society which women going to Trieste and Alexandria once left, and those goes for women who left from many other places too. Let me end this discussion of memory with yet another society and its people and migrants. During World War II, Jamaican men, as well as women in smaller numbers, supported the Allied war effort against the fascist Axis. At the end of the war, they were sent home discarded. Having minds of their own, they got together, and in 1948, more than 400 took the passage to Britain as migrants on a boat called the Windrush. Today's Jamaican children grow up with bedtime songs commemorating the migration. Windrush child, fly the kite of your dreams. My mother, she worked damn hard down in England. Grandma visits England. Memories can be truthful, can be sad and joyful at the same time. If Jamaican children can deal with migration, why can't allegedly eminent writers? Let me move to my concluding thoughts. I've mostly dealt with the past. Divina, of course, was from the present. By changing dates, place names, and individual names, this is also the story of the present. Insert the names of Bangladeshi villages or small cities in the Philippines. Women, like Divina, migrate globally into domestic and caregiving work. Philippine men into commercial shipping, Bangladeshi ones to oil platforms of the societies of the Gulf of Hormuz. Ethnic hierarchies continue. Among bourgeois families in Rome, Filipinas are valued. They are Catholic and often have some English. Somali women are denigrated. They are black, not Catholic, and come from a former colony of Italy, fascist Italy to be exact. All of these migrants try to gain a livelihood at their home, their place of birth, which the place of birth does not provide. Almost all societies of the globe have become what they are by migrant men and women inserting not only their labor power, the body parts approach, braceros, hands, muscles, but also their human capital and their personalities. At different periods over time, many or most societies of the globe have also not been able to provide for all of their members. Modern political theory, as well as legal provisions, make all inhabitants of a state citizens. What political science has not discussed is that some states have transformed themselves into export organization for the laboring bodies to which they have downgraded the poorer parts of the so-called citizens. The Philippines, Mexico, and Bangladesh are the best-known examples. There are others. Nepal and Bhutan have for 2 centuries supplied surplus men to Britain's imperial armies. Is this merely a phenomenon of the so-called lesser developed societies? If we look at Britain, from the 1880s, imperial population planners sent orphans, children of parents deemed incapable of rearing them, unmarried women who would be a burden to society in the minds of male bureaucrats, and slightly disabled soldiers from the colonial war out of the country. Rather than deportation, they called this empire settlement scheme. Sounds better, doesn't it? Some of those deported left autobiographies. They reported loneliness, abandonment, mistreatment, or initial bewilderment, and then an assiduous planning to extract themselves from the unwanted situation and to lead self-determined lives. Probably the Alexandrinke were a few thousand only, but in one perspective, they resembled millions of women across the globe and across the ages. In another, they were contributing to specific family survival, to provide education for their children who might, in yet another perspective, sorely miss them. They were leading their own lives, and in a political perspective, were keeping one country, fascist Italy, from dispossessing farming families of Slovenian language and culture from their land. That's a big plate they were delivering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dirk. Now we have 10, 15 minutes for the discussion. I would really like to hear your opinion or comment. How would you place in this broad, global, and historical perspective the drowning of the people in the Mediterranean Sea? Migrants.
In a perspective quite similar, though the outcome was very different, to the Europeans who crossed the Atlantic. These people in the present are leaving societies and local places that cannot feed them, cannot feed their families, and the 55 million Europeans left for the very same reasons. The Europeans could take strong ships, very few, only the old sailing boats in the early part of the 19th century sometimes founded, but they had strong ships. Shipping companies treated them as customers, and that meant they wanted them to arrive well and then immediately write home and tell their neighbors, use the same shipping company they use as well. At the time in the 19th century, the societies were open. We call it the period of the open door. And not only are societies closed now, I did mention the passport and visa regime, which was invented only around 1914 and immediately after, a few years before. And Europe in particular has made itself into a fortress. Schengen, in a way that facilitates our travel inside, is a disaster for all people outside. And if we would simply not consider this distant in the Mediterranean, but kind of looking at the labels in all our dresses, shirts, blouses, many of them are made for cheap labor somewhere else in the country where people try to get away from low wages and come to Europe or North America, or now that Russia is developing also to Russia. So from the economic frame, there is no difference. There's a huge difference in attitudes to migrants.
Thank you. Next question.
I was quite touched, let's say, by your observation of loss of skills, particularly with male migrants. And I completely agree with your observation. But lately we were observing a different trend, which we can also place within the United States, for example, with the falling apart of Russia. Just one example, they were attracting numbers of highly skilled scientists, intellectuals to support their latest development in science and technology. How do you, was this maybe a late observation of an, let's say, ignorant as I am in this field, or did you see some similar developments earlier that go in this same, let's say, context?
First, to connect these migrations to the ones I talked about, at one point I mentioned the body parts approach. In the United States, the Mexicans are called braceros, arm. The rest is not interesting for them. These migrants, and the movement is called brain drain. It's brains people are interested in, the US in this case, and not really the full persons. The people who come on this level have more possibilities to insert their own interests and capabilities than migrants have. Much of migration history, even in the positive periods of the open door, is basically mainly interested in migrants who fill the exact gaps that the society has. Infrastructural work, domestic work, and now academic work in the universities. They usually do not directly say so because it sounds too economist and too self-centered, but the economic interest is always there. Have migrants, intellectual migrants, been attracted in earlier periods of time? The easier answer is they have been pushed out. The fascist societies didn't want intellectuals, and many had to flee. Other societies have attracted intellectuals, scholars in a broader sense, not only the modern scientists, but scholars in the broader sense. Though it's not much talked about, between the Japanese and Chinese empires, there was an exchange and there were influences. Often scholars traveled on their own to really enlarge their experience, but then were kept by the receiving society. If we look at the court of Charlemagne, who is so important in European historical memory, also memory that I don't happen not to share, but the intellectuals at his court, the so-called Carolingian Renaissance, were scholars from England, from France, from elsewhere. There is an attraction in the migration, perhaps not simply a buying out, but, well, the US didn't have to buy out. They could offer better wages. And Charles the Great, so-called great, offered a scholar a whole monastery with all the serfs involved, and he could live well and do his scholarships. So there are similarities, but they have to be studied very carefully that we do not get into uneven developments. But the buying out has been less studied than the scholarly migrations between medieval universities.
Hello, thanks for the presentation, it was really good, thank you. The question that I have is, 50 years ago my father immigrated from Slovenia to Canada.
Mm.
And one thing that I find quite interesting about that is that today the situation there really hasn't changed. Canada's doors are still wide open to people who want to immigrate there and maybe start families, get a job. And I just wanted to hear your opinion on when do you think that may change in the future, like countries like India, China. Are we going to see migration trends to Asia eventually when these countries become as big as they're supposed to become? Are we going to see that change in the future? I mean, will America eventually close its doors to migrants? And same thing, I think same thing is true for Australia, if I'm not mistaken.
That's a difficult question. If kind of I had my will, societies would simply be open. In open societies, at least in the past, with the ever-increasing differences between the highly developed, high-income countries and the low-income countries, this may have changed and we do not have data. But as long as societies are open, people do not have to migrate. They can sit and lean back and say, well, I'll do it next year or perhaps after. The moment a state announces it will close its borders, there's a mass rush in. Migration, in a way, is self-regulating because people migrate to get jobs. And when the labor market goes down, migration goes down. There is a huge amount of migration in most other regions of the world, but we are kind of geared to look at the North Atlantic part of the world. Ghana in West Africa is an immigration country for all the regions around, and the doors were not really open, but the borders were also not controlled, and that came out as the same. At one point, during an economic crisis, migrants were pushed out, but they came back. South Africa, of course, is an immigration country for the whole region. Countries with enough manpower of their own, Mexico is one example, India is another, usually do not attract migrants in large number or only in particular slots. Australia, I think, will continue to need migrants for a long time. That Canada or the US will turn their whole policy around, I don't see coming, at least not on short notice. In those countries who sort of prohibited migration, the whole socialist bloc had, if we look closely, internal migrations. And some of the countries, the People's Republic of China, has more than 200 million internal migrants, and they are crossing borders because they're not permitted to enter the cities on an equal basis. It's an attempt to slow down migration, but living conditions in the countryside are so poor that people still leave. So we have globally at the moment about 200 million people who live in a country other than the country of their birth, and more than 200 million in China alone. I don't have the figures for India. This mobility cannot be stopped, and the European Union was really working hard at it and paying this whole new border force, still has about, according to the best studies, which include an aspect of gas, between 800 and 900,000 workers undocumented who are liable to heavy exploitation. So having a managed immigration policy like Canada and the US have would make Europe's situation easier, and much more so those whom you asked about who now have to cross on miserable boats the Mediterranean.
Would you agree that an example of a reverse flow is the Japanese community in California before the Second World War, which was treated very poorly after the Pearl Harbor, and once the economic situation in Japan improved, there was quite a large number of Japanese that were returning home. Is that an example of a so-called reverse flow?
Yes, it's a small example. In most migrations, people arrive, and some of them realize they cannot achieve what they want to, and they return. In this case, it was the heavy discrimination that made people return. Italians throughout the history had a relatively high rate of return, in particular from the United States. They could not deal with the totally different social settings, societal practices. It was not only discrimination, it was so different. Those Italians who went to Latin America had a far lower return rate. So we do have return migration in many countries, which also is not studied for a very long time. Even the term emigrant says someone is leaving permanently, and immigrant says someone is entering. That's why we have changed the terminology to migrant, and then work out how often they migrated, whether they migrated stages and on. To continue the Japanese example, for a while, several of the Latin American economies turned down. At the moment, we have the opposite development. Peru was in the dumps, Brazil was at that time in the dumps, and both had received considerable Japanese migrations from the 1880s, and Japanese could go to all of Latin America when the US and Canada closed their doors to migrants from Asia. With the downturn, a considerable number, I'm not sure, at least several 10,000s, maybe even 200,000 Brazilian, Japanese left for Japan. And they had mingled with Brazilians, of course, and they didn't look quite Japanese. And for racial reasons, they never got the jobs they wanted in Japan and they were qualified for. So the return migration kind of induced a reverse discrimination. But the important thing is that wherever we look, we also have to look at returns.
Who start to feel migrants, foreigners, when they return.
Yes. They talk about home, this cliché of home, which is the figure of our speech. It's not a home, it pushes people out, and then people always talk about home, but don't realize that home has changed all the time. And they have this mental stop when they leave, live for 20 years elsewhere, return, and think they return into a place of 20 years ago. And that doesn't work. And then they often leave permanently. Yeah. Thank you.
If there is no more questions, we will continue with our discussion in a more informal way downstairs. I would like to thank again our guest, Professor Dirk Hoerder. Thank you.
Thank you.